Hey everybody, Jonathan Fields here, really excited because I'm sharing some time with a recent friend of mine, a guy who's done some really cool things in the world, and a best-selling author. I think it probably was enlightened 2 or 3 years ago, so he's floating above the planet somewhere. And a visionary and a leader, somebody who's built a really substantial business in a way that's very cool also. So Chip Conley, great to be hanging out with you.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's great to be with you too.
So, for those that don't know your story, you've got a really interesting story, a story of hardcore business and a story of awakening folded into that. Would you mind just sharing a couple of minutes and telling us a bit about that?
Yeah, I am a West Coast guy. I spent some time on the East Coast as well, but I went to Stanford University, went to Stanford Business School, graduated with Seth Godin. Seth and I wrote our first books together, actually, while we were second-year business school students. And then I started my company at age 26, called it Joie de Vivre, which is a very impractical name for a company in the U.S. since people don't know what it means and it's hard to pronounce, hard to spell, but it means joy of life. And so the purpose of the company was to create a boutique hotel company, and we ended up growing after 25 years, because the company's now 25 years old. We grew into the second largest boutique hotelier in what I used to say the U.S., but now we're told second largest in the world. Along the way, I always wanted to be a writer. And so I've written 4 books. The first one was 12 years ago called The Rebel Rules, Daring to Be Yourself in Business. Richard Branson wrote the foreword. But really, this is really a story of 2 books. About 10 years ago in the dot-com bust, we were really struggling. We were the largest hotelier in the Bay Area. And I ended up really reacquainting myself with Abe Maslow and his hierarchy of needs pyramid and self-actualization. And we reinterpreted Maslow's hierarchy of needs for our company. And ultimately, I wrote a book called Peak, How Great Companies Get Their Mojo from Maslow. And that's when I really got the fever about the idea of how do I go and use psychology principles and spiritual and philosophy principles in the context of business. And then we had another downturn. This is the story of 2 downturns, 2 Jewish shrinks, and me, I guess. In this downturn, I was actually less of a gladiator and self-actualized in the world and more of a prisoner. So I started reading Viktor Frankl's book and Man's Search for Meaning. And from that, ended up creating what I call an emotional equation, which led me, I'll tell you a little bit more about that, it led me to writing this book, which is, if you want to, there you go, there it is, Emotional Equations. What's it called? Emotional Equations, Simple Truths for Creating Happiness and Success. And today, that's where I'm spending my time, is I'm primarily a writer and speaker now after 24, 25 years of being a founder and CEO. I had John Pritzker, whose father started Hyatt, bought a majority interest in my company, and has allowed me, and we merged with a company in New York called Thompson. And so, it's allowed me to go and spend more time at the intersection of psychology and business.
Right. And there's also, you and I have had this conversation before. There was a precipitating event that you shared with me on stage that that kind of shook your world a bit. Can you share that?
Yeah, well, let's see. In 2008, so the Peak, that book came out in September 2007, and I was like, wow, people like hearing me speak and reading my stuff, and this was great. I was on the road, and going into 2008, things got really rough. The economy got rough. One of my closest friends committed suicide. His name was Chip. Strangely enough, he's the first of 5 friends to commit suicide in this downturn. And then I started having my own dark days, many of them. That's part of the reason I started reading Man's Search for Meaning again. I broke my ankle playing baseball. It became a bacterial infection because of a cut on my leg I hadn't seen. And I was on a strong antibiotic and giving a speech in St. Louis for my book Peak. And at the end of the speech, I went flatline on stage. Well, actually, initially I went unconscious. And then about 5 to 10 minutes later, thankfully, when the paramedics were there, I did go flatline. And over the next hour and a half, I was flatline and not flatline and in the hospital for a couple days. But it was a bit of a divine intervention. They never were able to figure out what was wrong with me. But it was an awakening in terms of saying, I don't want to be CEO of this company anymore, and we're in another downturn. I've got to figure out a way to, for the sake of the company and for the sake of myself, extricate myself from these invisible handcuffs and release myself from prison. And so that's when I started using Viktor Frankl's work, and I turned it into an equation, Man's Search for Meaning, And the equation was despair equals suffering minus meaning. And the reason I actually came up with that was because I needed to remind myself on a daily basis when I was feeling the suffering. As you know, Jonathan, it's the first noble truth of Buddhism is suffering is ever present. And so I could see the suffering. Suffering was the constant in my life. The variable in my life was meaning. So if this is an algebra equation, suffering constant, meaning is the variable. And what I saw is when I found meaning in something, despair went down. And so I started using this on a private basis 3 or 4 times a day. For months, I was not talking to anybody about it. And it was at our senior executive retreat, 80 of our top leaders. We have about 3,500 people in my company that I started. And we had the top 80 leaders at a retreat in November of 2008. And I was supposed to be the cheerleader, rah-rah, getting up and saying, okay, we're going to make it through another downturn. We made it through that dot-com bust. We tripled in size. But I didn't feel that.
Yeah.
What I felt was something much deeper and more profound. And what I saw in the room was 80 executives all focusing on the suffering. And so I threw my speech away and I said, I want to talk to you about this little equation I created that's helping me get through the days. And we talked about it and spent an hour on it. And after the speech, a few people came up to me and said, do you have an equation for jealousy? Or how about anxiety, which is why I love your book so much? Or how about happiness? And I ended up going to Bhutan and studying the Gross National Happiness Index, created an equation for that, was asked to speak at the TED conference, and then a publisher said, listen, you've got a book here. Simon & Schuster came forward and said, you should write a book about this.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, and you know, I so many directions I want to go with that. But you know, what's interesting to me is that so many people don't awaken to the idea that there's something bigger until there's some major incident in their lives. For me, one of the defining moments went up a long time ago when I was a lawyer is I ended up in the hospital after essentially 3 weeks without sleep and huge amounts of stress. I perforated an intestine, had a huge abscess in the middle of my body. You know, thankfully everything was fine now. But part of the reason I write, I think, and part of the reason I do what I do is to create experiences that awaken that same understanding that there's something bigger that I need to embrace without having to have people suffer or have some sort of potentially, you know, really major event that traumatizes them. I wonder if that's a bit of what drives you as a writer.
Yeah, I think, you know, being a writer or any kind of artist allows you to look a little bit more metaphorically at life. And when you can get beyond the literal of what you're experiencing and maybe see the meaning or some kind of bigger theme that's going on, it helps a whole lot. For me, the question, I asked myself 2 questions at the depth of that valley. I kept asking myself, what's the lesson in this? Which was my way of saying, what's the meaning? And the second one I said that has actually been very valuable as I've used this with other people now and talked a lot about it with other people, is that we're very used to going to the gym to work out our body and to know that if we don't work out our body, it atrophies or it bloats. And the fact is that when it comes to our emotions, we don't think of ourselves as going through emotional boot camp, but that's really what a recession does to us. And so the question that we need to ask ourselves is what emotions or emotional qualities are we learning right now as if we're in the gym, such that when we get through this, and we are going to be much better at resilience or courage or humility or authenticity. And as a result of that, it gives you a sense that the workout that you're having is meaningful and it's not just suffering or, you know, being cursed.
Right. So, and you took a lot of this and you basically, like you were explaining, you start to say, okay, beyond feeling these and expressing it, is there some way that I can make sense out of it? And it sounds like you have this interesting brain, you know, sort of like left-right brain thing going on, where it's like completely out there on one side, but then the other side is like, how do I make this analytical and logical, and so that it's applicable and shareable in a way that people can say, okay, it clicks.
And when I was at Stanford Business School, one of my professors, you always have the opportunity to talk and in class, and I was the youngest guy in the class, and Seth was the second youngest guy in the class, Seth Godin. And at one point, because I would sort of go in a lot of different directions, the professor said, okay, Mr. Conley, it's time for your left brain, right brain tango. Let's watch your tango, your left brain. So yeah, I think for me, the meta issue here is that when we're going through external chaos in our lives, and as a society in the US, we haven't gone through this external chaos since the 60s, but probably not since the 30s. When we have external chaos, we look for internal logic. And when we're looking for internal logic, we're typically looking for something that gives us some ballast or a rudder.
Right, sure.
Some people use, that's why fundamentalism becomes religious and political fundamentalism becomes very popular in these kind of times. That's why Nazism actually rose in the 1930s in Germany. So what I'm looking at, in fact, back in the 1930s, we had Norman Vincent Peale, Dale Carnegie, Napoleon Hill, the Serenity Prayer, Viktor Frankl. So what I'm saying is, how do we make sense of that mystery that we call our emotions? How do we move it from a mystery to a mastery? How do you actually get to a place where your emotions, you actually have some sense of what's happening inside you, and what are the various ingredients that create anxiety or happiness?
Right. And I want to, we talked about this, I want to explore one of these. You have a book full of really interesting formulas, and I want to explore one of them, and the one we're going to talk about is thriving. But I want to throw out a point and just deal with it very pointedly before we go there, which is that you have a book here which deals with a lot of emotional issues in a time that's a difficult time, and we live in times of amplified uncertainty. It's challenging, but at the same time there's mass opportunity around it. But there are a lot of people that are going through a lot of emotional swings, and whenever I write a book or whenever I write a blog post or something like this, where I sort of dabble in this world of giving advice there, I'm always concerned that people lean on my advice when they have bigger issues where they need professionals involved with what's going on. How do you handle that when you write a book, which is really giving advice on a deep emotional level, but at the same time, you and I, we're not licensed psychologists or psychiatrists. So what's the advice that you sort of wrap around the book?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I have a foster son who has a borderline personality disorder, and the last thing I'd want him to do is to purely use my book. He needs additional therapy. He needs additional resources that can help him help him to thrive and help him to get to a place where there are deeper issues that need to be considered there. So the last thing I want someone to do is say that my book is the Bible. What I want them to think about is this book and this idea as a resource, as a means of people understanding, day to day, how can they create some logic and sense that their emotions are like adult finger painting. We learned Isaac Newton created the color wheel. I didn't know that, but I learned that in the process. That guy was pretty smart. He did calculus and the telescope and gravity, and he also created the color wheel.
There's a rumor he created the internet too, but
yeah, that was Al Gore. So there is a comparable to the color wheel, and it's called the emotion wheel. And a guy named Dr. Robert Plutchik created that back in the 1980s and 90s. And it's actually in the book, Emotional Equations. And what he was able to say is there's a premise that actually there's some primary emotions, and when you combine two primary emotions, you get a secondary emotion. You combine red and blue, you get purple. And so that's what the book is about. It's really taking something that was actually already out there, but it hadn't really been taken very far, and it wasn't mainstream at all. And how do you actually make it real in your life and practical as a how-to ability to have emotional intelligence?
Right.
I was very lucky that Dan Goleman, popularized emotional intelligence, helped me a lot, spent a lot of time with me talking about this book, and talking about how to make emotional intelligence practical and what I call to make yourself more emotionally fluent. So that it's not just about being intelligent about it, but it's literally understanding what that pain in your throat or your neck or your stomach or your head is telling you, and being able to translate it into something that allows you to influence it.
Right. So let's dive into it then and explore one of your formulas. And when we were just talking a few minutes ago, you were talking about a formula for despair. And I think what we're going to talk about is almost the opposite of that. It's the formula for thriving. So talk to me about this formula. What is it? How did it come to you? And how does it unfold?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm glad you used this one because in some ways from a credibility perspective, this is one that actually gives a lot of credibility to the idea, because this is the only formula in the book that I didn't come up with. So all the other formulas I came up with, this one I didn't, and this one was created by Barbara Fredrickson, who wrote a book called Positivity. Great book. Great book. If you go to positivityratio.com, you can take a positivity test and just get a sense of what your positivity is. So with her permission, I changed the title of it to Thriving, because the way the equation works is it's positivity equals the ratio of positive things in your life to negative things in your life. It's sort of actually one of the sort of simpler equations in the book. But here's the background behind it. What she was able to see, and it's partly because of work that Daniel Kahneman did, years ago.
Sure.
What we know about people is that when you have a negative experience in your life, it has 2 to 4 times more power over you in terms of how it affects your emotions than a positive experience. So knowing that, what Barbara started to look at is, why is it that the psychology community has seen negative things like anxiety as being good for evolution, but positive emotions like joy are not positive, don't do much for evolution. And she did a deep study, and she ended up finding this theory that positive emotions broaden and build you, allow you to think more broadly and more creatively, and great for innovation, great for thinking about being curious. So what she came up with was an equation, and did a bunch of studies to show that we need about a 3-to-1 ratio of positive to negative influences in our lives in order to actually get to a place where you get into what's called a positive sort of spin. We've heard about like the negativity spiral down. Well, there's such a thing as a positivity spiral up, such that there's a momentum that's created from the positive. But you have to get to about a 3-to-1 ratio. So I started to do a little bit more research on this, and then I actually learned about John Gottman.
Sure.
Gottman, who's a lot of work on marriage, and he's been able to go and watch a couple for 10 minutes and say with 90 to 95% certainty whether they're going to break up or not. And what he was able to show in marriage is there's a 5-to-1 ratio.
5-to-1, right?
Exactly. And for people who are going to be in divorce soon, it's 0.8-to-1 in terms of positive to negative. So what do you make of this? So okay, great. There's actually a guy named Dr. Keltner, the Greater Good Society out in UC Berkeley, who has something called the Gen ratio, Jen, which comes from sort of Confucius times. It's about your benevolence ratio. So at the end of the day, there's all this existing stuff out there that says that in our lives, in order to thrive and to get into that positivity, we need to create a 3-to-1 or maybe more in a romantic relationship, 5-to-1 ratio, to create some kind of momentum, a domino effect to the positive. The way I like to think of it is as a pond. You throw a stone in the pond, you have a ripple effect. So let me give you one example of what we started doing in my company, just as a means of doing this as a leader. So what I saw, we started doing this about 10 years ago during the dot-com bust. What was very clear to me in our executive committee meetings, we had 15 people. We'd come together once a week on Tuesday mornings. It's our top 15 executives in the company. And these 2 hours were depressing. It was sort of like a sweat box.
Right.
It was like a sweat box because it just felt like all we were doing was talking about all the negatives. So what we did at the end of our 2-hour session is we decided to change the last 10 minutes. And I said, I want you to come in, if you like, with an example of someone in the company. Not someone in this room, but somebody in the company, line-level employees at hotels or restaurants or spas, who did something pretty amazing in the last week that deserves some recognition. And so the first week we did it, only 2 people actually raised their hands and talked about somebody. But by the 6th or 7th week, almost everybody was coming with an example. So example could be the head of operations raises his hand and says, I want to say thank you to Joe the bellman at the Hotel Rex. The Hotel Rex has only one elevator. It went down for 2 days, and Joe worked double time, 16 hours a day, 2 days in a row, while he had family in town from New York. So that would go around the room. Someone from a different department would say, I'm going to go say thank you to Joe. So 3 things happened out of this from the thriving positivity ratio. Number 1 is we ended our meetings on a positive note. Because again, if you start just focusing on all the negative all the time, it's important to do it.
Right.
You end up getting into this negativity spiral. So it was a positive thing for that team to end the meeting and feel like there's some positive things happening. Number 2 is Joe, the bellman, got recognized. and now there's a little ripple of positivity around him. And then thirdly, the fact that we had someone from a different department instead of operations go say thanks to Joe made a difference as well. So by coming up with these examples of great things that are happening at a time when everything was so negative, it actually helped to shift the energy, and it helped to shift the conversation. And most importantly, one of the things that I believe strongly is that great leaders, or what I call chief emotions officers, like CEO, chief emotions officers, they're good at understanding the emotions of the people around them, because our emotions are contagious. We know emotional intelligence is important, but we also know that emotions are contagious. So if you create an environment, I call this psychohygiene, and it actually comes from Abe Maslow. When you create great psychohygiene, that sweat box, instead of us leaving the room feeling smelly, we've actually done some kind of, sort of metaphorical shower together. We've actually had the opportunity to cleanse ourselves by either talking honestly about what's going on, like I did with our executive, at that meeting with 80 people, and when I introduced my despair equation, or with this group of 15 people on a weekly basis. It gives us the opportunity to focus on some of the positive things. So the thriving equation really just speaks to the idea that in the worst of times, you as a leader need to look at what are you doing to create some positives that people can focus on.
Right. Yeah, and I love it. It's funny you mentioned Barbara Fredrickson, because these are the two books on my desk right now.
Perfect.
Your book and her, I'm a huge fan of her work and just that whole approach to the way the mind works. What was interesting too, and I've been familiar with Gottman's work for a long time, and I can't remember if Fredrickson talks about this, is there's a cap to that ratio too. I remember in Gottman's work, when you hit 9 to 1, you start to go above that, it actually starts to be destructive. You reinitiated the downward spiral.
It's unnatural. I think there's two reasons for that. One is it's unnatural for us as humans to actually get to that level, so it doesn't feel real. And secondly, there's the classic thing is we take for granted. If you get to that point where there's that much, you don't have a comparison of negative. Sailboats. Barbara in her book talks about the sailboat analogy. Right. If you look at a sailboat, the mast is 3 times longer than the keel. The keel is the thing that goes down into the ocean, and that sort of balances the boat. And the mast is what gives it the power to move forward. So that 3-to-1 ratio is not just a ratio for us as humans. It may have some relevance to just physics.
Yeah, it's fascinating, right? I remember her talking about that also, that there is this, if you completely eliminate all the negative, it's almost like all the positive loses its power. It's almost like we habituate to it, and we need that contrast of even a taste of the negative to sort of to set us right, and make us realize maybe how fortunate we are on some level.
And that's why we need people like Barbara Ehrenreich. So you have Barbara Fredrickson for positivity, and you have Barbara Ehrenreich, who's the one who just sort of tends to complain about the world. But what she's talked about in her book about where she thinks that America is a little too positive minded, she just says we get into this positive thinking thing that by just positive thinking we're going to manifest things. And I'm not saying that. I want to make sure that everybody's clear on that. The chapter on thriving in the book is not about just how to get into the positive frame of mind. Right. You have to take actions. And the example I used about the executive committee is an example of an action we took. But by just actually getting in the positive frame of mind alone, that's one step, but it's actually barely the first step.
Yeah, and I totally agree. And that's always a challenge that I've had with some of the stuff that stays purely metaphysical and doesn't actually say, let's bring this, actually create some actions and some things that are happening in the world around it. Well, I love this conversation. I know, I want to respect your time here because we sort of set aside a certain amount of time, but where can people learn more about you, about the book?
They can learn more about the book at emotionalequations.com. And actually, normally I have a chipconley.com site that's different than that. Right now, that's under construction. So you can learn more about me at emotionalequations.com as well. We also have a Facebook page for Emotional Equations, and there's a Chip Conley author page too on Facebook.
Great. Awesome. Thank you so much. It's been great. I love the conversation around thriving. So everybody, experiment with that. Check out that 3-to-1 ratio. And I have actually experimented with it deliberately. It makes a very real difference. So check it out. Check out the book. Check out Chip and what he's up to all over the world. Really good stuff. Enjoy the conversation.
Great. Thanks, John.